A name that promised destiny. A lineage bathed in power, shattered by grief. From war heroes to presidents, plane crashes to whispered disappearances, why does tragedy follow the Kennedys like a shadow no light can burn away? This isn't politics, it's something older, deeper, colder. A curse, maybe. Or just the cost of being chosen. These are the unexplained mysteries of the family that couldn't stop dying. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. The air was sharp with salt and oil as the B-24 Liberator taxied along the windswept runway at RAF Fursefield in East Suffolk. It was the 12th of August, 1944, and the war had entered its bloodiest logic. Each mission a gamble, every pilot an expendable part in a machine that never quite learned the value of a single human life. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Jr., eldest son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., stood tall among the crew that morning, his face solemn, his bearing unshaken. He was 29 years old, handsome, ambitious, and according to nearly everyone who knew the family, he was supposed to be the first Kennedy to become president. He never made it past England. That morning, Joe Jr. climbed aboard a modified B-24 packed, not with bombs, but with explosives, nearly 21,000 pounds of Torpex, a powerful material meant to destroy fortified German positions. He wasn't meant to drop the payload. He was meant to fly the plane on a remote-controlled test mission, part of a daring experimental project codenamed Operation Aphrodite. The plan was chillingly simple. The pilot and co-pilot would take the bomber into the air, arm the explosives, switch over to a remote control system, then parachute out over the English countryside. Allied controllers would then guide the unmanned aircraft to its target. The plan sounded efficient, even modern. It was anything but safe. What happened next unfolded in silence and fire. 2 minutes after Joe and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Wilford Willey, radioed that they had armed the bombs and were preparing to bail out, the B-24 exploded midair. The blast was so powerful that it shattered windows in towns miles away. Wreckage rained down on farms and roads across Suffolk. There was no firefight, no German enemy nearby. Just an accidental detonation, a technical failure with no recovery. Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. was incinerated instantly. His body was never recovered in full. What was left of him was gathered and buried in a grave marked by absence more than remains. The family received the news with the polished stoicism of political training. His father, the famously ambitious Joseph Sr., was devastated. The favored son, the one he had groomed for greatness, was gone. In a single violent moment, the Kennedy future had shifted to the shoulders of the second son, John. But it's the strange absence of questions around Joe Jr., his death, that makes the story feel incomplete. Operation Aphrodite was controversial, even then, a desperate tactic born from frustration. The project had already claimed the lives of other crews, and several missions had failed before his. Some military officials believed the technology was rushed, untested, and hazardous. Others argued the risk was worth it. Joe volunteered anyway, reportedly eager to prove his valor, perhaps to win his father's approval, perhaps to define himself beyond the weight of expectations. But those expectations may have helped kill him, because in truth, Joseph Jr. didn't need to volunteer for the mission. He had already completed the required number of combat flights to return home. This one was optional. He chose it. His choice raises uncomfortable possibilities. Was it pure bravery, or a burden of duty too heavy to decline? Was it patriotism, or a fatal attempt to outrun the gravity of his family name? His father had always spoken of destiny, of a Kennedy in the White House, of the family's obligation to serve not just the country, but history itself. Joe Jr. was meant to fulfill that narrative. Instead, he became its first casualty. In many ways, his death marked the beginning of what would later be whispered as a curse. The Kennedys lost more than a son, they lost their original narrative. After Joe Jr.'s death, The path to greatness didn't disappear. It just grew darker. The younger brother who stepped into his shoes, John, would take the Kennedy name further than any of them imagined, but would pay for it with his life. At the time of Joe Jr. His death, America didn't ask too many questions. He was a war hero, posthumously awarded the Navy Cross and the Air Medal. The story fit the mold, a brave young man sacrificing his life for his country. But the strange experimental nature of the mission, the lack of proper safety protocols, and the sheer force of the explosion left behind something that resembled not just tragedy, but omen. Even in loss, Joe Jr. remained an ideal. The perfect son, the uncorrupted hero, the first Kennedy to die before the world could watch him fall. And perhaps that's why his death remains somewhat frozen in time, cleaner, simpler, easier to process than those that would follow. But the silence around it echoes in later chapters. No scandal, no conspiracy, just a brilliant young man turned into fire above English soil. And yet, what feels like closure begins to unravel as we follow the ripples. Because the next Kennedy to die wasn't even a Kennedy by blood anymore, but her story would expose how deeply the family's tragedies could reach, even after marriage, even in peacetime. Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy was the family rebel, the social firebrand the sister Joe Jr. had loved most. And she was about to meet her own end, on another plane, in another country, with almost the same sudden, explosive silence. Kathleen "Kick" Kennedy. By the time she died, Kathleen Kennedy had already broken most of the rules her family pretended not to enforce. She had loved outside the church, married outside the party line, laughed too loudly in front of cameras. And yet, for all her perceived rebellion, Kick remained the emotional center of the Kennedy siblings, their confidant, their favorite, the one who walked into a room and made the air feel less heavy. Her life was brief, brilliant, and brutal in its ending. Born in 1920, Kathleen was the fourth child of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, and arguably the most magnetic. Even as a child, she carried a kind of social gravity. Everyone noticed her. Her father, Joe Sr., doted on her with a mixture of awe and indulgence. Her mother, more devout, watched with suspicion. Kick's charm had an edge to it, an irreverent sparkle that didn't quite fit within the rigid expectations of a wealthy Irish Catholic household. The war brought her to England, where she volunteered with the Red Cross and mingled effortlessly with British aristocracy. It was there she met William Billy Cavendish, Marquess of Hartington, heir to the Duke of Devonshire. He was soft, spoken, elegant, Protestant. Against her family's wishes, Kathleen married him. The union was brief and haunted by war. Billy was sent to the front lines just weeks after their wedding. 4 months later, on the 9th of September, 1944, he was shot by a German sniper in Belgium. Kick was widowed at 24. The marriage had created a schism between Kathleen and her family, particularly her mother Rose, who viewed it as not just a breach of faith, but a kind of betrayal. After Billy's death, Kick remained in England, reluctant to return to the suffocating expectations of her family's compound in Massachusetts. Her letters became more introspective. She seemed older, dimmed, but not diminished. In the years that followed, she began a discreet but passionate relationship with the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, Peter Fitzwilliam, a divorced man with a complicated past and a sizable fortune. They planned to marry. Kick, in her own words, wanted a life of my own choosing. But once again, she found herself on a collision course with the Kennedy machine. Peter was not only Protestant but also divorced, and once again, her mother disapproved. Joe Sr. was more tolerant, or perhaps simply more weary. After losing his eldest son and seeing Kathleen's marriage end in battlefield blood, he may have understood that control was an illusion. Then came the flight. On May 13, 1948, Kathleen and Peter boarded a small chartered plane in Paris, bound for the French Riviera. They planned to vacation, to talk about their future. The aircraft, flying through turbulent weather, veered off course and slammed into a mountainside in southeastern France. All 4 people on board, including Kathleen and Peter, were killed instantly. The wreckage was mangled beyond recognition. Her body was eventually recovered and buried in a modest cemetery in England, far from Hyannis Port, far from Arlington, far from anywhere a Kennedy might be expected to rest. Only her father attended the funeral. Kick's death didn't make headlines the way her brother's deaths would later. There were no parades of grief, no national moments of silence. But inside the family, her loss cut deeply. John Kennedy, then a rising political star, called her the star of the family. Even decades later, siblings and cousins would speak of her with a kind of haunted nostalgia, as if she represented something lost beyond repair, not just a sister, but a lost version of themselves. Unlike Joe Jr., Kathleen's life had been more public, more contentious, more defiant. But in death, she was quickly enfolded back into the mythos, a Kennedy who died too young, too far from home, under circumstances that felt too sudden to be anything but symbolic. There is no evidence of sabotage, no whisper of conspiracy, just a crash in bad weather, with a flight path never corrected. But still, her death feels thematically heavy. 2 Kennedys dead in the skies of Europe within 4 years. 2 plane crashes. 2 broken arcs. One meant to be president. One meant to live out loud. Both ended without warning. In the years that followed, the family rarely spoke of her publicly. Perhaps it was the discomfort of her independence, or the spiritual friction her choices represented. Perhaps it was just grief, raw and unresolved. But silence does to memory. Over time, Kik became more of a ghost than a figure, less a person, and more a cautionary footnote in the growing catalog of family tragedy. Her story, while often overshadowed, remains one of the purest examples of what would later be called the Kennedy curse. Not because of the crash itself, but because she died in the pursuit of her own life. She was not a politician, not a public figure. She was not trying to carry a torch or shape a legacy. She just wanted freedom and was punished for seeking it. Her death also expanded the radius of the so-called curse. It wasn't just about those holding office or chasing ambition. It could reach sisters and spouses. It could strike on foreign soil, in peacetime, without political motive. It was indiscriminate. It simply required that you carry the name or be close enough to feel its weight. And yet, as final as her story seems, it leads to an even quieter tragedy. A child never known to the world, born to a future president and a grieving mother, lived only for a moment before vanishing entirely from public consciousness. Kathleen Kennedy's death was shocking in its drama. But the next loss in the Kennedy timeline would be almost invisible, forgotten not because it didn't matter, but because it occurred before anyone had the chance to pretend it didn't. Arabella Kennedy. She never took a breath, never cried, never opened her eyes. Her name was Arabella, and by the time history recorded her, she had already been buried. Born still on the 23rd of August, 1956, Arabella Kennedy was the first child of John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy. Her story exists in the shadows of legacy, not a chapter, not a headline, but a silence between more public heartbreaks. In the official White House biography, her name does not appear. In many historical timelines, she's a footnote or an asterisk. But within the Kennedy family, Arabella's death marked something deeper. It was the first time John and Jackie were touched directly by the inexplicable unraveling of life. And though it did not stop them from pushing forward, it carved a quiet scar that never fully healed. Arabella was born in Newport Hospital in Rhode Island, the product of a pregnancy that had seemed typical until the very end. No major complications, no signs of distress. But when Jackie went into labor and delivered early, the baby was stillborn. No heartbeat, no motion, no second chance. Medical understanding of stillbirth in the 1950s was limited, and parents were often given little explanation. Just a closed casket and a suggestion to move on. They buried her in Arlington National Cemetery, in a grave that would remain unmarked for decades. For a long time, the story of Arabella was left out of family lore, perhaps because it was too intimate, or too early to fit the public image being crafted. JFK was a rising senator at the time, with White House ambitions already circulating behind his casual grin. Jackie was the fashionable, enigmatic wife who would eventually become a style icon and grieving widow in the same lifetime. There wasn't room in that narrative for a stillborn daughter. But Arabella's absence left behind a shape in the Kennedy mythos, an outline that would become easier to recognize with time. Because in that unspoken grief, something began. A pattern of children lost, of heirs never born, of lineage interrupted. Arabella was the first, but not the last. There is little speculation surrounding her death, no mystery in the conventional sense, but the mystery lies in what she represented, the beginning of the Kennedy family's entanglement with private sorrow. Before the assassinations, before the plane crashes and overdoses, there was Arabella, a child mourned in silence, without press or procession, without funeral cameras or black veils. And that silence is what gives her story its uneasy weight. For Jackie, the loss was devastating. Letters from the time hint at a fragile emotional state, a sudden retreat into privacy. Friends noticed a change in her afterward, a greater guardedness, a deeper wariness about public attention. And for John, always torn between his political ambitions and his private incapacities, the death of his first child reportedly shook him more than he admitted. He was not yet the man whose brains would be scattered in a Dallas limousine. He was just a father who had walked into a hospital expecting life and left with a name to bury. In later years, Jackie would give birth to two more children, Caroline in 1957 and John Jr. in 1960. But before them, there was Arabella, the child who gave the future president his first experience of grief. And perhaps that shaped something in him, an understanding of fragility, a recognition of how quickly joy could turn to loss. In a family obsessed with legacy, she offered none. No speeches, no scandals, no careers cut short, just a void. Decades later, in 1991, Jackie had Arabella's grave, officially marked with a headstone. By then, she had lost her husband, her son Patrick, and many others. The cemetery at Arlington had grown to include more Kennedys than anyone would have expected, but Arabella's name finally appeared, simple, stark, and late. As if even in death, she had to wait her turn in a family forever rushing forward. It is tempting to see her as a symbol, a quiet beginning to the tragedy that would come, but symbols require intention, and Arabella never had the chance to create one. She remains what she always was, a daughter never known, a presence that shaped her family through her absence. And in the catalog of Kennedy losses, hers may be the most complete. No controversy, no speculation, just the unbearable stillness of a child never held. And yet, even this was not the end of infant loss for the Kennedys. Less than a decade later, when John F. Kennedy was president, he would once again walk the halls of a hospital listening for a sound that never came. The birth of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy would follow a similar trajectory, early, complicated, and doomed. But this time, the world would be watching. What had been personal sorrow in 1956 would become national mourning in 1963. And once again, a child's brief, desperate life would echo far beyond its short duration. Patrick Bouvier Kennedy. It was meant to be a moment of joy in the summer of 1963, a nation on the edge of change, a president still basking in the afterglow of a Cold War standoff narrowly avoided, and a young First Lady entering her final trimester. But when Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born 5.5 weeks premature on the 7th of August, everything unraveled almost instantly. He was the third child of John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, and unlike Arabella, who had been stillborn 7 years earlier, Patrick came into the world alive, barely. He weighed just 4 pounds, 10 ounces. His skin was bluish, his breathing ragged, his tiny chest barely rising. Diagnosed with hyaline membrane disease, now known as infant respiratory distress syndrome, Patrick's lungs had not fully developed. In 1963, the medical world had few tools to intervene. It was a diagnosis that came with quiet inevitability. Premature babies could survive, but only if they were lucky, or rich in time, or spared by something science hadn't yet found. And even the Kennedys, rich in every other way, had no answer for that. Immediately after birth, Patrick was transferred from Otis Air Force Base to Boston Children's Hospital in an incubator aboard an ambulance helicopter. He was intubated, monitored, and kept in a neonatal unit where machines did their best to replicate what his body could not do on its own. Jackie, still recovering from the C-section at Otis, remained behind. For 2 days, the president stood vigil by his son's bedside, watching the machines measure out heartbeats like grains of sand. In those quiet hours, John F. Kennedy ceased to be the most powerful man in the world. He was simply a father, leaning over the tiny body of a son he might never know. He asked questions doctors couldn't answer. He stared at the pale, translucent skin of a child suspended between two worlds. And as each hour passed, hope diminished by degrees. Patrick died on the 9th of August, just 39 hours after his birth. The nation was stunned. Newspapers ran headlines not just about the infant's death, but about the president's visible grief. Images of JFK, typically stoic, almost stage-managed, showed a man hollowed out by something even he could not control. Jackie, still in recovery, was devastated but physically removed from the moment. Her nurses later recalled long stretches of silence. She spoke to few people. She barely ate. The first couple retreated from public view. And for a time, it seemed as though grief might finally unmoor the image the Kennedys had spent years crafting. For a family so often perceived as invincible, the death of a newborn stripped away the veneer. It made them real, human, mortal, and more than that, it made them vulnerable in a new way. Patrick was buried near his sister Arabella in Arlington. 2 children, one silent at birth, one gasping through borrowed hours. In a strange, wrenching symmetry, Jackie now had 2 children who never came home. She would later reflect on Patrick's death as the most painful loss of her life. Even the assassination of her husband, which would occur just 3 months later, she endured with a kind of detached shock. But Patrick's death, she said, was personal in a way nothing else could be. There was no politics, no camera lenses, no nation watching, just a mother who had run out of prayers. The tragedy of Patrick's death extends beyond the grief of his parents. It became a medical turning point. His treatment was among the first high-profile cases that helped accelerate research into respiratory distress syndrome. Decades later, advances in neonatal care, including the introduction of synthetic surfactant therapy, would drastically reduce infant mortality from the condition that killed him. In death, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy helped change medicine. But that knowledge did nothing to ease the pain at the time. Legacy does not comfort the living. There are few surviving photos of Patrick. No home movies, no recordings of laughter or first words. Only hospital reports, newspaper clippings, and the recollections of those who stood nearby during his brief life. He exists in the public memory more as a symbol than a child, a point of empathy for a president often seen as untouchable. But to JFK, Patrick was a son, and those 39 hours reshaped the final days of his life. According to close aides and friends, something softened in the president after Patrick died. He became more contemplative, more present with his family. On the political front, He remained engaged, but privately, something had shifted. He began making tentative plans for a second term that would leave more room for his children. He spent more time sailing with Caroline and John Jr. He called Jackie more often, left meetings to check in with her, and tried to be near her whenever possible. These gestures didn't erase the strain in their marriage, but they reflected a man who now understood how fragile everything truly was. 3 months later, John F. Kennedy would ride in an open limousine through Dealey Plaza in Dallas. The loss of Patrick Bouvier Kennedy didn't cause what came next, but it deepened the gravity of what followed. Because by the time JFK was assassinated, the Kennedy family had already endured the deaths of 2 children. The image of Camelot was already cracked. The myth of invincibility was already broken. And that's what makes Patrick's short life so haunting. He was supposed to be the next beginning, a new son, a fresh start after political storms and family grief. Instead, he became another name in a growing list of losses. His birth was a flicker of hope. His death, a shadow that never lifted. In those final months of 1963, Jackie Kennedy experienced something no mother should: the burial of a child followed by the murder of a husband. The two events, so close together, became fused in public memory. Grief layered over grief. A family bent under the weight of its own legend. But even that double blow would not be the end. For the name Kennedy, tragedy does not arrive in sequence. It accumulates. And before the blood dried in Dallas, the pattern was already writing its next line. Because just as John F. Kennedy had been shaped by the death of a son, his younger brother, Robert, was moving toward his own rendezvous with a moment that would echo with the same finality, the same heartbreak, and the same unbearable sense of déjà vu. John F. Kennedy. It began with confetti and ended with gunfire. It always does, when the fall is mythic enough. By the 22nd of November, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had already become more than a man. He was the living sculpture of American ambition, composed of youth, war medals, high cheekbones, and an easy defiance of gravity. His presidency, though brief, had become a projection of something larger than politics, a symbol of potential. He had faced down nuclear annihilation, called the nation to the stars, and wrapped it all in a smile that somehow made danger seem like destiny. And then he died, in the full brightness of day. Dallas, Texas. Late morning. The sun was unfiltered, almost too bright for what followed. Air Force One had landed at Love Field, just before noon. Kennedy emerged into the crowd with Jackie beside him, dressed in her now immortal pink Chanel suit. The motorcade rolled through downtown, past waving schoolchildren and tight-lipped Secret Service agents. Kennedy waved, smiled, looked right into the eyes of strangers. The car moved slowly, about 11 miles per hour, just enough time for history to take aim. At precisely 12:30 p.m., as the open-top limousine turned onto Elm Street through Dealey Plaza, 3 shots rang out. The first missed. The second struck him in the upper back and exited through his throat. The third shattered his skull. In less than 6 seconds, the most carefully curated image in modern American life was unmade. Jacqueline reached for pieces of his head, as if trying to gather time itself. The Secret Service lunged. The motorcade lurched toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, but it was over. By the time the doctors rolled him in, the damage was irreparable. At 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy was declared dead. Officially, the cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. Unofficially, it was everything. The vulnerability of power, the gravity of family legacy, the volatility of a country that could no longer agree on what it believed in. The suspected assassin was a 24-year-old former Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald. Arrested within hours, Oswald never stood trial. 2 days later, he was shot and killed on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. Conspiracy theories blossomed like weeds: organized crime, foreign intelligence, internal betrayal. Every frame of the infamous Zapruder film was scrutinized for proof that the truth had been bent or buried. But the real mystery didn't live in the footage. It lived in the simple, unanswered question: why him? Why this man, in this moment, in this way? John F. Kennedy had survived war. He had stared down Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He had outmaneuvered his own health problems, Addison's disease, chronic back pain, constant infections, and concealed them behind charm and posture. He had endured political warfare both from his enemies and within his own party. But in Dallas, there was no maneuver, no secret plan, no escape. And what lingered wasn't just the assassination, it was the feeling of rupture, of something snapped at the center. Kennedy wasn't the first president to be assassinated. He wasn't the first young leader to be taken before his work was done. But he was the first to die on camera, the first whose death was televised, photographed, looped, and dissected for generations. The first whose murder became a form of national media, a trauma with a broadcast schedule. Jackie returned to Washington with her husband's blood still on her skirt. When asked if she wanted to change, she refused. "Let them see what they've done," she said. The country did see. And what it saw, it could not unsee. The funeral was stately, somber, and suffocating. World leaders stood in solemn rows. The eternal flame was lit at Arlington. John Jr., just 3 years old, saluted his father's casket. It became one of the most iconic photographs in American history. A child frozen in grief, saluting not just a parent, but an entire myth in descent. And still, in the deepest corners of public and private mourning, a quiet refrain took shape. The Kennedy family had lost a second son to violent death. And the nation began to murmur what the family had only begun to suspect. There was something inescapable about it all. Something patterned, something beyond coincidence. John F. Kennedy had inherited the legacy meant for his older brother. He had fulfilled the trajectory Joseph Sr. had envisioned when he spoke of his sons as instruments of national destiny. But no one had envisioned the ending. The polished speeches, the motorcade parades, the Cold War brinkmanship, they had led to a blood-stained Lincoln Continental and a ruined day in Dallas. What was lost was more than a presidency. It was the idea that a family could be groomed for greatness without punishment, that charisma could protect, that lineage could rise without falling. And that loss didn't repeat itself like a seasonal tide. In the aftermath, the Kennedy name was transfigured. Not just a family, but a mythos. Not just politics, but prophecy. A name now associated with not just power, but the cost of it. But while America mourned its president, the Kennedy family braced for what was still to come, because grief had a sequel. And the man who now stood in JFK's shadow, his younger brother Robert, was already being pulled into the same orbit. He would take the torch, yes. He would believe, as his brother did, that politics could be moral. But the road that began in Dallas led directly to a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles. And what was lost there would not be just another Kennedy, but perhaps the last glimmer of what they once believed power could do. Robert F. Kennedy. He had never wanted the spotlight, at least not in the way his brother did. Where John was charismatic, elegant, and bred for public life, Robert was intense, private, and driven by something quieter, rage, maybe, or duty, or guilt. He had been the fixer, the enforcer, the one who stood behind the scenes making the machine run. And yet, when Jack was killed, it was Bobby who inherited not just the political ambition, but the grief. In those first months after Dallas, Robert F. Kennedy was shattered, not just mourning, but hollowed. He withdrew from public appearances. He visited his brother's grave almost daily. Friends said he would sit there in silence for hours, unmoving. The man who had once been the relentless attorney general, hammering organized crime and pushing civil rights through a reluctant system, was now adrift. The Kennedy myth had been decapitated, and Bobby was left to decide whether it was still worth chasing. He didn't rush into it. He waited, he grieved, and then he returned. By 1968, the country was unrecognizable from the hopeful nation that had elected John 8 years earlier. Vietnam had become a quagmire. Civil rights leaders were being assassinated, cities were burning, and public trust in government was eroding like old paint. And in that chaos, Bobby Kennedy entered the presidential race, not as a politician, but as a reckoning. His campaign was raw, urgent, and deeply emotional. He didn't promise perfection, he promised to listen. In towns hollowed by poverty, in cities scarred by racial injustice, in universities haunted by the war draft, he stood before angry crowds and didn't flinch. His speeches weren't polished. They were often improvised. His voice cracked. He leaned into the discomfort. People didn't just support him, they needed him. He ran on the edge of something impossible, hope that had already failed once. On the 5th of June, 1968, Bobby won the California Democratic primary. It was a critical victory, enough to make him a serious contender for the nomination. That night, in the crowded ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he gave a short victory speech just after midnight. "Now it's on to Chicago," he said, smiling, flashing the Kennedy E's for a final time. Then he turned to exit the stage and walked through the kitchen pantry toward a scheduled press conference. It was there that Sirhan stepped forward. The 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant was armed with a .22 caliber revolver. He fired multiple shots in quick succession. One struck Bobby behind the right ear. Chaos erupted. People screamed. Others tackled Sirhan to the floor. Kennedy collapsed onto the tile floor, bleeding. A busboy named Juan Romero cradled his head. Bobby looked up and whispered, "Is everybody all right?" A strange, quiet echo of a man who had lived his life asking the wrong questions at the right time. He was rushed to the hospital. Doctors operated for hours, but the damage was massive. Bone fragments had torn through brain tissue. At 1:44 a.m. on the 6th of June, Robert F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. Just over 5 years after his brother was killed, Bobby had followed him into the abyss. Another Kennedy shot in public. Another motorcade. Another procession. Another country in mourning. But this time, it wasn't just grief. It was exhaustion. A sense that something irrevocable had broken. Bobby's death was not only a tragedy, it was a pivot. His campaign had galvanized a coalition of young people, working-class voters, and marginalized communities. In his absence, the 1,968 Democratic Convention imploded. Riots broke out in Chicago. The party fractured. The movement stalled. And for many, his assassination marked the moment when idealism bled out of American politics. What lingers in his story is the almost unbearable sense of inevitability. It had happened before. The open limousine, the sudden shots, the unfinished speech. And like his brother, Bobby had entered a moment of national chaos and tried to hold it together through sheer force of will. But will was not enough. Not for him, not for any of them. His children, 11 in total, became another generation marked not just by lineage, but by loss. They would grow up with the Kennedy name as both shield and shackle. And in time, some of them would follow the same path. Public service, private turmoil, tragedies echoing in quieter, more fragmented ways. Sirhan was arrested on the scene. His motive was murky, his trial short. For years, debate has swirled over whether he acted alone, whether others were involved, whether the angle of the bullet wounds made sense. But unlike JFK's assassination, Bobby's murder never evolved into the same universe of conspiracy. Maybe because the grief was more intimate. Maybe because the nation had already exhausted its outrage. In the final analysis, Robert F. Kennedy died not as a statesman fulfilled, but as a promise interrupted. He had not yet reached the presidency. He had not finished what he started. He died on the way there, halfway between mourning a brother and becoming one. The phrase, Kennedy curse, was still in its infancy in 1968. It hadn't yet solidified into the cultural shorthand it would become. But Bobby's death cemented the pattern. It was no longer a question of coincidence. It was chronology. An older brother dies in war. A sister in a plane crash. A president assassinated. An infant buried. And now, a senator, perhaps the last great hope, gunned down within shouting distance of triumph. After Bobby, something shifted. The Kennedy name didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It became more fragile, more burdened, a legacy trying to outrun its own gravity. And just when it seemed the worst was over, just when the blood had stopped pooling on hotel tiles, the pattern reasserted itself in the most unexpected place of all. At a house, on a quiet street, where a woman who once loved a Kennedy would open her front door and not survive what came next. Athalia Ponsell Lindsley. She wasn't a Kennedy by blood, and by the time she died, she hadn't been a part of their world for decades. But Athalia Ponsell Lindsley belonged to that strange category of people who drifted close enough to the family to touch its gravitational field and far enough away to fall from it, hard. Once poised to marry Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., she ended her life not as a political spouse or society matron, but as a murder victim on her own front porch. Stabbed, slashed, and silenced in one of the most brutal unsolved crimes in Florida history. Born in 1917 in Toledo, Ohio, Athalia Ponsell lived a life that always seemed on the edge of something larger. She grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, and eventually made her way to New York City, where she became a model and television personality in the early days of live broadcast. She had poise, beauty, and sharp wit, qualities that made her both appealing and difficult to ignore in a world that often demanded women choose one or the other. It was during World War II that she reportedly became romantically involved with Joe Kennedy Jr., the first son of the Kennedy dynasty. Friends described their relationship as serious, even heading toward engagement. But when Joe Jr. died in the skies over East Suffolk in 1944, Athalia's connection to the Kennedys ended abruptly. She was not welcomed into the grieving inner circle. She was not mentioned in the official obituaries. Whatever future she imagined alongside him disappeared in fire and wreckage. From there, her life veered away from the orbit of politics and into something stranger. She married briefly in the 1950s, divorced, traveled, wrote, and by the early 1970s had resettled in the quiet, historic district of St. Augustine, Florida. It should have been peaceful, a place for reinvention, retirement, a place to outlive the glamour and grief of youth. Instead, it became a stage for her final act. Athalia remained outspoken, engaged, and politically active. She ran for a seat on the St. Johns County Commission. She wrote fiery letters to the editor. She clashed often, publicly and personally, with her neighbors, particularly with a man named Alan Griffin Stanford Jr., a former city employee and local contractor who had been fired after clashing with her. Their feud was no secret. The tension between them simmered openly. Police were called more than once. Legal threats were exchanged. Complaints filed. But none of it seemed unusual. Just the type of friction common in small towns where boundaries are personal and everyone knows everyone else's history. On the 23rd of January, 1974, Athalia was at home in her white Victorian house on Marine Street. It was a sunny afternoon. Around 5:30 p.m., as daylight began to fade, a neighbor heard shouting and the unmistakable sounds of a violent struggle. Another neighbor, a teenager, looked across the street and saw a man standing over Athalia on her front steps. He was holding what looked like a machete. By the time police arrived, it was too late. Athalia's body was found just outside her front door, mutilated. She had been struck with a blade multiple times, her face and upper body savagely wounded. Her small dog had also been killed, likely trying to protect her. Blood trailed down the porch and into the brick walkway. The crime scene was chaotic, brutal, and strangely public. Suspicion immediately turned to Alan Stanford. The motive was obvious. Witnesses had reportedly seen a man matching his description leaving the scene. He was arrested and charged with murder. But the trial was a disaster. Key witnesses weren't called. Physical evidence was scant and poorly preserved. The teenage neighbor who had seen the killing later said he had been pressured to stay quiet. The case quickly devolved into confusion and conflicting testimony. Stanford's defense team painted Athalia as eccentric, paranoid, even unstable, implying that her political feuds and erratic behavior had made her enemies beyond counting. The jury deliberated for just over 2 hours. Alan Stanford was acquitted. No one else was ever charged with the crime. In the years that followed, Athalia's murder faded into local legend. The house where she died became a point of whispered interest on ghost tours and true crime podcasts. Her grave remains unmarked, and her name rarely surfaces in the broader narrative of the Kennedys. But her story belongs there, in the long shadow of the family's misfortunes, not because she bore the name, but because she loved someone who did. Because she was touched by the same flame and, years later, consumed by a different one. What makes her death so haunting isn't just the violence, it's the randomness. The sense that even years after leaving the Kennedy orbit, the proximity to that name still came with a price. Athalia didn't die in a plane crash. She wasn't assassinated. She didn't overdose or crash into a tree. She was murdered on her own front porch, in daylight, in view of her neighbors, by someone she had feared, and the law did nothing. If the Kennedy curse has rules, this one broke them. But maybe that's the point. Maybe there are no rules, only an expanding radius of loss, moving outward from the center until it pulls in everyone who once stood too close. Even the ones history forgets. Athalia was buried with little fanfare, her name unlinked from the dynastic scripts that carried on, but not erased. Just waiting, like so many of the others, to be remembered not for who she was in public, but for how she disappeared in private. And the quiet tragedy of her ending would soon be echoed, though in a very different form, by someone who carried the Kennedy blood directly, a young man whose demons didn't come from enemies across the street, but from within. His death wouldn't be public. It would be private, numbing, and slow. A hotel room, a syringe, and the heavy legacy of his own last name, David A. Kennedy. He was born into a name already soaked in light and shadow, and he spent most of his life trying to escape both. David Anthony Kennedy, the fourth of Robert F. Kennedy's 11 children, didn't ask for the legacy he inherited, but it marked him anyway, etched into his DNA, his expectations, and eventually, his obituary. From the beginning, David was a quiet, sensitive child. Family friends recalled a boy who hung back in crowds, more observer than participant, often lost in thought even at a young age. He bore the Kennedy look, tall, dark-haired, striking, but he didn't carry the Kennedy polish. Where his brothers seemed to glide through life's rituals with practiced ease, David stumbled. He was prone to introspection, emotionally raw, sometimes withdrawn. And after his father was assassinated when David was just 12, that emotional distance deepened into something more dangerous. He had been watching television in a Los Angeles hotel room with his siblings when Robert F. Kennedy was shot in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel. The moment seared itself into him. Afterward, David's behavior changed. He became quieter, moodier, more prone to sudden outbursts or long silences. In private, he spoke about his father's death not as a memory, but as a presence, something still happening, still unfolding inside him. Grief calcified into identity. By the time he reached adolescence, David was already experimenting with drugs. First alcohol, then marijuana, then pills. By college, he had begun using heroin. In the 1970s, the Kennedy name still carried weight in public, but behind closed doors, family members scrambled to manage crises, rehabs, relapses, hospital visits, and police encounters, all hidden behind the same photographs of sailboats and smiles. David enrolled at the University of Virginia, then transferred to Stanford, but his academic path was sporadic. He would vanish for days, sometimes weeks. He checked into rehab several times, only to relapse not long after. Friends described a young man at war with himself, desperate to break free from a name that felt both protective and suffocating. In 1973, while visiting Nantucket, David was a passenger in a Jeep driven by his brother, Joseph P. Kennedy II. The car flipped. David was injured. Their friend, Pam Kelly, was left paralyzed. It was the kind of incident that would define most people's lives, but in the Kennedy universe, it became just another incident to manage. Quiet settlements, public silence. But for David, it was another weight added to an already sinking soul. He tried to rebuild. He wrote. He traveled. He stayed close to his mother, Ethel, and often took care of his younger siblings. But the addiction never left. It lived just under the surface, ready to surge back at the slightest opening, and it did. On the 25th of April, 1984, David checked into room 107 of the Brazilian Court Hotel in Palm Beach, Florida. He was 28. A few days earlier, he had visited the grave of his father on the anniversary of the assassination. Friends later said he was unusually quiet after that visit, contemplative in a way that suggested something had turned. He had been in and out of detox earlier that month, trying again to stop. But the burden of grief, guilt, and expectation, compounded over years, was more than he could carry. On the evening of the 24th, hotel staff noticed that David had not left his room. The next morning, they entered and found him slumped in the bathroom. He had died of a drug overdose. Cocaine and Demerol were found in his system. The cause of death was ruled accidental. There was no scandal, no high-speed crash, no political motive. Just a young man alone in a hotel room, needle in arm, trying to silence something too large to name. His death wasn't surprising. It had always felt close, but it was no less devastating for its predictability. Another Kennedy lost. Another grave at Arlington. Another line in a family eulogy that was beginning to sound like repetition. Public reaction was muted. The 1980s had dulled America's appetite for Kennedy drama. The press reported the story with mechanical solemnity, and within days, the news cycle moved on. But inside the family, David's death hit differently. He wasn't a political figure. He wasn't chasing office. He had no headlines to leave behind. He had simply tried, and failed, to survive his own legacy. His siblings grieved in private. His mother, Ethel, rarely spoke of the loss publicly, but those close to her said something changed in her afterward. A kind of stillness, as though the family's pattern of tragedy had finally reached a frequency too high to bear. David's death, like so many others in the Kennedy orbit, defies simple explanation. It wasn't the curse, exactly, not in the supernatural sense. It was more like pressure. The constant silent pressure of living inside a name that didn't allow for ordinary pain. When David broke, he did so in the least public way a Kennedy could, out of sight, not on a battlefield. Not in a motorcade, just a hotel room, the door locked, the story small. And yet, it didn't end there. Because the Kennedy name doesn't allow for finality, it stretches, repeats, echoes. And just over a decade later, another of Robert's sons would die. But not quietly, not invisibly. This one would be skiing in Aspen, chasing speed, carving arcs into the snow, until the tree didn't move and the body didn't bounce. The next tragedy would arrive with force, sudden and sharp, a collision that felt almost staged in its symmetry. Because for some reason, the Kennedys never just fall, they crash. Michael Lemoyne Kennedy. He was the kind of man who seemed built for forward motion. Tall, athletic, affable. A former high school football star who moved through the world like a Kennedy was supposed to, effortlessly. Michael Lemoyne Kennedy, sixth son of Robert F. Kennedy, had the same dark hair and confident gait as his brothers. He smiled easily, shook hands like a politician, and carried the kind of restless ambition that never quite declared itself outright, but never fully disappeared either. He wasn't in office, but he was always orbiting it. Law school at the University of Virginia, a stint with the family's political action committee, fundraising for the Democratic Party. Leadership roles in organizations meant to carry on the work of his father. He chaired the organization, Stop Handgun Violence. He managed his uncle Ted Kennedy's 1,994 Senate campaign. For a while, it looked like he might run for something himself. But behind the momentum, things began to come apart. In 1997, Michael Kennedy's public image took a direct hit when it was reported that he had engaged in a sexual relationship with an underage babysitter who had worked for the family. The girl, reportedly 14 when the relationship began, later said it continued for years. The allegations rocked the already battered family. Michael denied any criminal wrongdoing. The woman, by then in her 20s, declined to press charges, but the scandal didn't go away. It trailed him into rooms like a second shadow. He stepped down from his work with Citizens Energy Corporation, the nonprofit he had helped run, and retreated from the political limelight. For a family well acquainted with public scrutiny, the story marked another low point, another stain on the veneer of service and sacrifice. But it was on the 31st of December, 1997, that everything stopped. The Kennedy family had gathered in Aspen, Colorado, for their annual New Year's ski vacation. They had done it for years, an upper-crust tradition played out in the white silence of the Rockies, a brief intermission from the noise of East Coast life. Michael, 39, had been skiing with several members of the family, including his 3 children. It was a holiday, a ritual, just another day in snow and sunlight. But that afternoon, Michael joined a group, including at least one of his brothers, playing a high-speed game of football on skis. No helmets, no caution. Just the kind of reckless thrill that felt like Kennedy DNA. He was seen racing downhill, weaving through trees with the ball tucked under his arm. A few witnesses recalled him laughing. Others said he looked focused, even tense. Then he hit a tree. The impact was massive. Michael wasn't wearing a helmet. Ski patrol arrived quickly, and he was airlifted to Aspen Valley Hospital. But the head trauma was severe. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Another Kennedy downed in motion, another death that felt both cinematic and stupidly real. The news broke before midnight. The country woke on the 1st of January, 1998, to headlines of another dead Kennedy and a new year that already felt old. For many, it was déjà vu. Plane crashes, overdoses, assassinations, now a ski slope. For the family, it was another body in a widening line of coffins, another sibling gone, another child of Bobby who never made it to middle age. Michael's death, unlike David's, wasn't quiet. It was immediate, public, and stark. The ski slope was cordoned off. Reporters swarmed the Aspen hospital. Family members arrived one by one, faces drawn, eyes shielded by dark glasses that never quite hid the exhaustion. There was no controversy about the cause, no ambiguity, no one to blame. Just a fatal combination of speed, snow, and arrogance. But beneath the surface, something deeper was at play. Michael's death marked a turning point for the family's narrative. In earlier decades, the tragedies had felt epic, assassinations, wartime heroism, political martyrdom. They were public losses dressed in ceremony, but by the late 90s, the accidents began to feel more domestic, more avoidable, more ordinary in their recklessness. They weren't symbols anymore. They were statistics. Michael left behind a complicated legacy. 3 children, a marriage that had strained under scandal, a nonprofit career that had helped the poor, a public fall from grace, and a death that looked, from some angles, like penance. Friends said he had been trying to rebuild in the months before his death, focusing on his kids, staying out of the spotlight. But the family's rhythm never allowed for stillness, and when it came time to play, to move, to chase speed down a hill, he did what Kennedys always did. He pushed forward. The funeral was subdued by Kennedy standards, held in Massachusetts, attended by the full family, lined with white flowers and pressed suits. The eulogies spoke of his generosity, his humor, his dedication to social justice. Few spoke about the scandal, the speed, the arrogance. That part, like so many chapters in the Kennedy family book, was left between the lines. And yet, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The Kennedys lost another son, another father, another bearer of the name. And though the world was no longer surprised, it still flinched, because the myth wouldn't end. Not even here. Not even on a snow-covered hill in Aspen. Michael's death, like the ones before it, left a vacuum. And into that vacuum would step the most visible heir of all, the child once photographed saluting his father's casket. The boy whose smile reminded the country of Camelot. The man the nation had quietly watched for decades, wondering if the crown would ever return to his brow. But John F. Kennedy Jr. wasn't walking toward power. He was flying straight into the sea. John F. Kennedy Jr. For most of his life, he didn't speak much. He didn't have to. John Fitzgerald Kennedy Jr. was born on the 25th of November, 1960, just weeks after his father won the presidency. His earliest years were lived in the echo chamber of history, crawling on the White House carpet, hiding under the resolute desk, waving at press photographers like a child learning diplomacy before language. He was only 3 years old when he saluted his father's casket during the funeral procession, a moment that became not just iconic, but inescapable. The boy who had lost a president father became a symbol of American mourning, even before he could understand what had happened. That image would follow him forever. In the years that came after, John Jr., or John, as the press called him, much to his dislike, became the reluctant torchbearer of a dynasty that had lost its central figure. His mother, Jacqueline Kennedy, raised him with intentional distance from politics, preferring privacy and classical education to legacy and campaign trails. He attended private schools, studied history at Brown University, and earned a law degree from NYU. Despite the name, he stayed out of politics. Not out of disinterest, but out of something closer to caution. He knew what the price of public service could be. He had watched it, repeatedly, up close. Still, the pull of his surname never faded. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, John Jr. occupied a unique space in American culture. He was both participant and relic. Tabloids followed his relationships, particularly with actresses and models. Magazine covers dubbed him America's most eligible bachelor. And yet, he never seemed frivolous. There was a seriousness beneath the smile, a quiet melancholy that betrayed the losses he carried. He spoke rarely in public, but when he did, his voice was low, thoughtful, self-effacing. He was a Kennedy, yes, but also something stranger, a man trying to live a private life on a public stage. In 1995, he founded George, a glossy political magazine that tried to reframe civic life through celebrity culture. It was an ambitious, flawed project. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Was it satire? Was it journalism? Was it just another vanity project? But the magazine reflected something deeper in John, a desire to engage with power without being consumed by it. In 1996, he married Carolyn Bessette, a Calvin Klein publicist. The wedding was secret, held in a small church on Cumberland Island, Georgia. The images, released afterward, showed John in a black suit and Carolyn in a simple ivory gown. They looked elegant, private, untouchable. But beneath the surface, things were fragile. Friends of the couple described tension almost from the beginning. John's fame was oppressive. Carolyn found herself followed, scrutinized, dissected by a press corps that still treated the Kennedy name like a standing inheritance. They fought. They reconciled. They tried to disappear into each other, but the glare never dimmed. And like every Kennedy story, theirs was already beginning to bend toward tragedy before anyone realized it. On the 16th of July, 1999, John Jr. piloted his small Piper Saratoga aircraft out of Essex County Airport in New Jersey. On board were Carolyn and her sister, Lauren Bessette. They were heading to Martha's Vineyard for the wedding of John's cousin, Rory Kennedy. The weather was less than ideal, hazy, poor visibility, humid air pressing down on the coast. John was a relatively inexperienced pilot flying without an instructor. He was certified for visual flight rules, not instrument-only navigation, but he took off anyway. The flight was never completed. Just after 9:40 p.m., the plane disappeared from radar. No distress call, no signal, just a blip gone missing. For 2 days, the coast was combed by air and sea. On the 19th of July, searchers found the wreckage about 7 miles off the coast of Martha's Vineyard, 120 feet beneath the surface. The bodies were recovered shortly after. John, Carolyn, and Lauren had all died on impact. The official cause of the crash was pilot error, spatial disorientation, a phenomenon common in low visibility conditions, especially among pilots flying over open water at night. Without a clear visual horizon, the inner ear can send misleading signals to the brain. The result: the aircraft enters a fatal descent, and the pilot doesn't realize what's happening until it's too late. John's ashes were scattered at sea. The final Kennedy to carry his father's name was returned to the ocean that had claimed him. The reaction was national, immediate, and oddly intimate. For millions of Americans, John Jr. represented not just the last link to Camelot, but the illusion that something pure had survived the wreckage. He hadn't run for office. He hadn't scandalized the family. He had simply tried to live. And now, like his father, he was gone in an instant, too soon, too violently, too publicly. But what made his death especially haunting wasn't just the finality, it was the symmetry. JFK died in a motorcade. John Jr. died in a plane. One in Texas, one at sea. One by bullet, one by misjudgment. Both deaths occurred at moments of forward motion, traveling, progressing, reaching for somewhere they never arrived. Both left behind a nation stunned into stillness. And just like that, the name that had once promised renewal now seemed spent. With John Jr., his death, something ended. There were still Kennedys, of course, politicians, philanthropists, advocates, but the myth had collapsed. The image of a young boy saluting his father had come full circle, returned to the ocean in the same silence it once punctured. Yet even that silence would not hold. Because the tragedy of the Kennedy legacy isn't just its crescendo, it's its inability to end. Even after the final curtain should fall, the echoes continue. The next generation would carry it forward, not in grandeur, but in quiet collapses, in gyms, in guest houses, in canoes. Because some curses don't end with crashes. They fade, patiently, privately, persistently, until only their residue remains. Cara Kennedy. She wasn't supposed to be the next one. Cara Ann Kennedy, the eldest daughter of Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, was born in 1960, the same year her Uncle John won the presidency. The same year, the family myth was crystallizing into something America could not let go of. Her birth was not marked with headlines or photographs or expectations. She was a girl, born quietly into a dynasty that made noise. But Cara would live her life inside that weight, nonetheless. Not on stages or ballots, but in the wings, where pressure still collects and history does not forget. She grew up in Washington, D.C., part of the second wave of Kennedys, those born into a world already grieving its giants. By the time Cara was 5, JFK had been assassinated. At 8, she saw her Uncle Robert murdered on television. She watched the adults in her life carry grief like a coat they couldn't take off. Her father, Ted, survived a plane crash in 1964 and the Chappaquiddick incident in 1969. He was the one who lived, the one who bore the responsibility of the family name as the sole surviving son of Joseph and Rose. And as his daughter, Cara bore a quieter version of that same responsibility, the need to carry forward something she never asked for. But Cara didn't pursue politics. She didn't give speeches. She worked behind the scenes. After graduating from Tufts University in 1983, she became a television producer, working on political and social issue documentaries. She was thoughtful, deeply committed to her work, and always conscious of the family name, aware of its power, wary of its reach. She married Michael Allen, had 2 children, and for a time, her life seemed untouched by the family's darker patterns. But then, the body turned. In 2002, at age 42, Cara was diagnosed with lung cancer. It was aggressive. The prognosis was bleak. Surgeons removed a portion of her right lung. Radiation and chemotherapy followed. She fought through the treatments with a kind of endurance that seemed almost expected in a Kennedy, and in time, she recovered, partially. Publicly, she returned to work. Privately, the toll was heavier. Cancer survivors often speak of a strange dislocation, being grateful and exhausted in equal measure. Cara felt that. Her health remained fragile. The treatments had weakened her heart, a fact known only to close friends and family. In 2009, Cara stood on the steps of the U.S. Capitol to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom on behalf of her father. Ted Kennedy was dying of brain cancer. The award was a final tribute. Cara's eyes were bright, but her face looked older than her years. She had spent her entire life watching men in her family die in front of cameras. This time, she was the one collecting the medal. 2 years later, she went for a workout at a health club in Washington, D.C. It was routine, nothing strenuous, a way to stay strong. She collapsed after finishing her session. The cause? A heart attack. Cara Kennedy was 51. The news barely made headlines. By then, the name Kennedy had lost its ability to shock. America had grown tired of grieving for the same family. The narrative had played too many times. Another child lost. Another parent left to mourn. Another funeral at Arlington. Her father had died 2 years earlier. Her brother, Congressman Patrick Kennedy, said afterward that Cara's heart had never fully recovered from cancer treatment. Others close to her believed she had never emotionally recovered from the death of her father. She had been his closest confidant, his silent anchor through scandal and sickness. When he was gone, something in her unmoored. Unlike the Kennedys who died in war, or in office, or in the glare of paparazzi flashbulbs, Cara's death was intimate. There was no scandal, no recklessness, no crashing car or downed plane. Just a woman who had endured too much, for too long, until the body gave out. Her life and death reflected a subtler cost of legacy, not spectacle, just erosion. She had no ambitions to lead, no need to be a face in front of cameras, but she still carried the family name and all its unseen heaviness. In the mythology of the Kennedy curse, her story lacks drama, but that's what makes it more chilling. Because not every tragedy arrives with impact. Some just whisper. Her children, just entering adulthood, buried her in the same graveyard where so many of their relatives rested. The Kennedy compound at Hyannisport grew a little quieter. Another room went dark. And the story could have ended there. Tidily, tragically, as they so often do. But grief in this family doesn't end with the body. It finds new forms, new hosts. It moves sideways, unpredictably. And before long, another death would strike, this time by a more familiar pattern. A woman who had married into the family, struggled with its weight, and collapsed under its scrutiny. It wasn't cancer, or a crash, or a bullet. It was the silence of despair, in a house too big for one person to carry alone. Mary Richardson, Kennedy. By the time she died, Mary Richardson Kennedy had already disappeared from public view. Not physically, she still lived at the sprawling estate in Bedford, New York, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. The house was vast, surrounded by trees and silence, and inside it, Mary drifted further and further away from the world she once seemed destined to belong to. She had married into the Kennedy family in 1994, becoming the second wife of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the third son of Robert and Ethel. From the outside, it looked like a perfect match. Mary was beautiful, educated, environmentally passionate, and deeply spiritual. She had studied architecture at Brown and had a sophisticated eye for design. She threw herself into green building projects, community causes, and philanthropy. Friends remembered her warmth, her intelligence, and her genuine desire to create beauty. But the pressure of the Kennedy name is not always visible. It moves beneath the surface, shaping lives in ways that can't be measured by photos or foundations. Their marriage, like many in the dynasty, was built on both affection and imbalance. Mary and Bobby Jr. had 4 children together, and for a time, their home was filled with motion, school drop-offs, charity events, holidays on the Cape, but underneath the rituals, something fractured. The marriage began to deteriorate. The causes were layered: infidelity, substance abuse, mental health struggles, long absences, and the vast, unspoken strain of living in the shadow of a name that never stopped asking for more. By 2010, the couple had separated. The split was bitter and public. Custody battles, legal filings, restraining orders. Mary's world began to shrink. Her finances were restricted. Her name became a talking point in tabloids. Close friends said she was unraveling. Her smile, so present in early photographs, faded. Her eyes changed. The house in Bedford, once a symbol of achievement, became a kind of containment zone. She reportedly struggled with depression, anxiety, and alcoholism. She sought treatment. She relapsed. The Kennedy network, which could be fiercely protective, seemed distant. On May 16, 2012, Mary was found dead in a barn on the property. She had hanged herself. A family employee discovered her body. She was 52. The news broke with a brutal kind of clarity. It was a suicide. There was no accident, no ambiguity, just finality and pain. Her family, in a statement, asked for privacy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., by then in a new relationship, did not attend the funeral, but held a separate memorial for her. The media, as always, circled. Her autopsy confirmed death by asphyxiation. But the deeper causes, those were never medically legible. In the weeks that followed, her friends spoke out, gently but firmly. They described a woman undone by a mixture of emotional abuse, public shame, and untreated illness. Her siblings criticized how she had been portrayed in divorce proceedings. They spoke of her compassion, her creativity, her desperate attempts to hold her family together. They described a system, both familial and legal, that failed her. Mary's death is different from the others in this lineage, not because it lacked violence, but because it lacked visibility. It didn't happen in a motorcade. It didn't make prime time. It happened quietly, in a private space, by a private decision. But its violence was no less real. Her children, teenagers at the time, were forced to navigate a grief no child should bear. Her home, once filled with the sounds of their lives, became a symbol of silence and questions. And for those watching from the outside, Mary's death confirmed something many had already feared: that the Kennedy curse was no longer just about death. It was about the slow corrosion of identity inside a system that rewards performance over peace. Mary had tried. She had built a life. She had created, donated, advocated. But like so many who enter the family from the outside, she had underestimated what it meant to be a Kennedy by marriage. The expectations, the scrutiny, the unrelenting pressure to either live up to the name or disappear trying. When she died, the public reaction was sympathetic, but distant. Another tragedy, another funeral. The myth moved on. But for those still within the Kennedy orbit, Mary's suicide cast a long shadow. It was a reminder that grief doesn't always look like an explosion. Sometimes it's a long, drawn-out silence. Sometimes it ends not with a bang, but with a rope in a quiet barn. And just when it seemed that the pattern might finally recede, that the name might go a year without new sorrow, it happened again. This time, to a granddaughter. A young woman who had grown up inside the family compound, surrounded by love, legacy, and the omnipresent ache of those who had gone for her. She was supposed to be the future, but the future was slipping through their hands. Saorise Kennedy Hill. She was part of the generation that was supposed to heal something. Born in 1997, Saorise Kennedy Hill was a child of the new millennium, a granddaughter of Robert F. Kennedy, raised not in the crucible of national tragedy, but in the quieter, more digitized terrain of modern adolescence. She had inherited the name, the eyes, the ambition, and perhaps, without her permission, the heaviness. But she also inherited something else: awareness. Saorise was bright, expressive, and outspoken in ways that earlier generations of Kennedys had not been allowed to be. She spoke and wrote openly about her mental health. She named the darkness. She refused silence. In 2016, while attending Deerfield Academy, one of the country's most prestigious preparatory schools, she published an essay in the school paper about her ongoing battle with depression. She didn't write around it. She wrote through it. Even though the struggles are uncomfortable, she said, I was lucky to be surrounded by people who understood and supported me, but there were still nights when I cried and couldn't tell anyone why. It was a startling moment of transparency in a family whose public persona had long relied on elegance, discretion, and managed appearances. Saorise broke that pattern not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. She was tired of pretending, and for a brief time, it seemed as though that honesty might carve a different path. She enrolled at Boston College and studied communications. She worked with organizations focused on mental health and social justice. She spent time at the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport, the ancestral home whose walls had absorbed more grief than most cemeteries. She swam, laughed, studied, posted online. She was, by all outward appearances, fighting the fight. But depression doesn't always announce itself. On the 1st of August, 2019, paramedics were called to the Kennedy compound. Saorise had been found unresponsive. Despite resuscitation efforts, she was pronounced dead that afternoon. She was 22. The autopsy confirmed what her family had already suspected: a fatal overdose. Toxicology reports revealed a mix of methadone, alcohol, and prescription medications. The death was ruled accidental. There was no note, no staged farewell, just absence and shock. Saoirse's death hit the Kennedy family with a kind of slow-motion horror. For all the tragedies they had already endured, plane crashes, assassinations, drownings, this one felt different. It was quiet, young, unprevented. The child had been asking for help. She had spoken the words aloud. She had been doing the work. And it hadn't been enough. Her mother, Courtney Kennedy Hill, Robert F. Kennedy's fifth child, issued a statement that mirrored the grief of 100 headlines before it. She lit up our lives with her love, her peals of laughter, and her generous spirit. But the words felt threadbare under the weight of repetition. How many times could this family describe the indescribable? At her funeral, Saoirse was remembered not just for her smile or wit or intellect, but for her courage in naming what had been hidden for so long. She had not masked her depression. She had not wrapped it in euphemism. She had told the truth. And somehow, even that wasn't enough to save her. Saoirse's death made clear that the so-called Kennedy curse had evolved. No longer did it stalk. Only the men in convertibles or the sons flying planes. It now lived in the bloodstream, inherited not just genetically, but spiritually. It haunted bedrooms, slipped into prescription bottles, waited in the corners of legacy and pressure. It no longer needed speed or scandal. It only needed stillness. And still, the story did not end. Not even here. Less than a year later, another Kennedy woman would vanish, not into addiction, not into despair, but into the water, again, this time with her son. A mother, a canoe, a spring afternoon, and a current that could not be outrun. As if the family name had once again been spoken too many times, and the tide, always listening, had come to collect. Maeve Kennedy McKean. On the 2nd of April, 2020, the world was already unraveling. The COVID-19 pandemic had locked down cities, silenced streets, and filled hospitals. Fear was ambient. Isolation was enforced. For many, it was a moment of pause. For others, it was a prelude to something else entirely. That afternoon, Maeve Kennedy McKean walked down to the edge of Chesapeake Bay with her 8-year-old son, Gideon. They were staying at the waterfront home of her mother, Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, the former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland and the eldest daughter of Robert F. Kennedy. The property was familiar, family-used, comfort-worn, backed by a stretch of gray water and cloud-streaked sky. Maeve and Gideon took a red canoe out onto the bay. The story goes that they were chasing a lost ball. They never came back. Within hours, the water had swallowed them. Search and rescue teams combed the bay through the evening, then overnight, then through the weekend. The water was frigid, unforgiving even in spring, and winds had pushed the small craft far from shore. For days, hope was offered cautiously. By the 6th of April, Maeve's body was recovered nearly 3 miles from the house. 2 days later, Gideon's body was found another 2,000 feet away. Both had drowned. Their deaths were ruled accidental. And yet, nothing about the story felt like an accident. Maeve was 40. A public health official, human rights lawyer, and mother of 3, she had dedicated her life to global health policy and advocacy. She had worked with the Obama administration, helped combat child hunger, and co-authored research on pandemic preparedness long before the term became daily vocabulary. She was articulate, disciplined, and known for her deep sense of moral responsibility, traits inherited directly from her lineage. She was also, by all accounts, joyful. Friends remembered her laugh, her dry humor, her capacity to juggle massive professional responsibilities with raising 3 children and staying grounded. In a family often mythologized into archetypes, Maeve felt real, accessible, fully alive. And so did Gideon. A bright, curious child with glasses and an insatiable appetite for questions, Gideon had the kind of early confidence that makes people say things like, "He's going places." At 8, he had begun writing stories, asking about politics, wondering aloud about fairness. His teachers said he loved math. His siblings said he loved chocolate. He was, in every way, a boy at the beginning. Their deaths hit differently. Not because they were more tragic, each Kennedy death contains its own unbearable gravity, but because they occurred in a moment of collective global grief. In 2020, everyone was losing something. But this loss felt like a footnote to a myth that refused to end. As the world watched ventilators rise and economies fall, the Kennedy curse seemed to glide quietly across the water, tip a canoe, and slip away beneath the surface. There were no planes this time, no gunshots, no scandal, just a mother and son, doing what parents and children do, playing, moving, reaching for a ball, and gone. The press, once so eager to consume Kennedy tragedies like serialized television, approached this one with more restraint. Maybe it was the pandemic. Maybe it was the child. Or maybe even the media, by now, had grown weary of writing the same story. At their joint funeral, held virtually, broadcast to a screen full of grieving faces, family members spoke of grace, of faith, of the light both Maeve and Gideon had carried. But beneath every tribute was the same unspoken question. Why again? Why always? Why still? Maeve's death was the 15th high-profile death or tragedy in the Kennedy family line, stretching back over 75 years. And yet, it didn't feel like the end of a line. It felt like a continuation, a soft echo of the same refrain. The ocean, the sky, the body, the disappearance. There is no answer, of course, no secret logic that can stitch these tragedies together into something neat. The Kennedy curse is not a curse in the folkloric sense. It has no incantation, no hex. It is a pattern, a shape, a repetition of ruin that doesn't need explanation to persist. Maeve Kennedy McKean did everything right. She gave, she served, she loved. And still, she was pulled under, without warning, without reason, in front of the child she tried to save. There are no more metaphors left. There's just a canoe, a ball, a wave, and a name that still, even now, does not know how to stop grieving. Rosemary Kennedy. She was the first daughter, the third child, the one the rest of them were supposed to protect, but didn't. Rosemary Kennedy was born on the 13th of September, 1918 in Brookline, Massachusetts, during a pandemic and just before a new century began to reshape the world. She entered life quietly, but with difficulty. The delivery had gone wrong. The doctor was late. The nurse, untrained in obstetrics, told Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy to cross her legs and hold the baby in. When that failed, she forced the baby's head back into the birth canal to delay the delivery. It worked. And it didn't. The trauma deprived Rosemary of oxygen at birth, just enough to alter something fundamental. As a child, she appeared sweet, affectionate, and eager to please. But there were signs. Her speech lagged. Her writing was uneven. Her coordination was off. And as she aged, it became harder for the family to pretend she was simply slow. She struggled in school. Her moods fluctuated unpredictably. She had violent outbursts. At times, she wandered off. She was sweet. She was frightened. She was unmanageable. And she was a Kennedy. In most families, Rosemary might have found her place at the margins, shielded, supported, perhaps even understood. But the Kennedys were not most families. Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. was a man obsessed with image, with legacy, with power. The success of the family depended on discipline, unity, and appearances. There was no space for unpredictability, no tolerance for difference. So he made a decision. Without informing his wife or children, Joe Sr. arranged for Rosemary, then 23 years old, to undergo a prefrontal lobotomy. It was a new experimental procedure being promoted as a cure for everything from depression to delinquency. In truth, it was crude brain surgery performed with little understanding of the consequences. Rosemary, according to the attending doctor, was cheerful and calm as she lay on the table. They drilled into her skull. They sliced into her brain. They asked her to recite nursery rhymes while they cut. Halfway through, she stopped speaking. After the surgery, Rosemary was no longer violent. She was no longer moody. She was no longer able to walk or talk. She had become quiet, pliable, and profoundly disabled. Her mental age had dropped to that of a toddler. The doctor called the operation a success. The family called it a secret. For over 20 years, the public, and much of the extended family, was told that Rosemary had been sent to a convent, or that she simply lived in seclusion by choice. In reality, she was institutionalized in rural Wisconsin, placed in a Catholic-run facility behind high fences. She remained there for the rest of her life. Joe Sr. never visited her again. Rose rarely did. Only one sibling eventually returned to her, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. In the 1960s, Eunice began visiting regularly. She listened to Rosemary's nonverbal cues. She interpreted gestures. She watched as the world had forgotten, reached for connection in the only ways left available. Those visits became the seed of a lifelong mission. Eunice founded the Special Olympics. She became an advocate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. She turned the family's failure into a campaign for visibility and eventually for dignity. But even Eunice never publicly criticized the decision. The family line was always carefully maintained. Rosemary was loved. Rosemary was safe. Rosemary was one of us. But if she was, why was she hidden? Why did the family not speak her name at public events? Why was her existence airbrushed from family photos, her presence treated like a footnote? For years, historians believed she had died young. Her name was absent from books, speeches, interviews. When she finally re-entered the family narrative in the 1980s, it was only as a symbol of how far the world had come, not as an indictment of what had been done to her. Rosemary died on the 7th of January, 2005, at the age of 86. She lived longer than most of her siblings, longer than Joe Jr., Jack, Bobby, Kick, David, Michael, John Jr., and others. She outlived them in silence, in stillness, in a space that was never fully hers. Her funeral was well attended, her name finally spoken aloud. But her story remains one of the most haunting in the Kennedy lineage, not because it was violent, but because it was deliberate. Not because it ended suddenly, but because it was slowly erased. Rosemary was not killed by fate or accident. She was altered by choice. Her tragedy wasn't that she was different, it was that her difference was treated as shame. And in that shame, the myth of the Kennedys begins to fray. Because for all the stories of ambition and sacrifice, what happened to Rosemary reveals something deeper and more disturbing. That the pursuit of legacy can make people disposable. That even within families devoted to public service, the most private pain can be hidden behind polished doors. She was not a casualty of war, not a victim of assassination. She was undone by the very institution that was meant to protect her, family. And that same institution would go on, richer, more famous, more tragic, carrying her absence like a shadow through every headline that followed. Every speech, every plane crash, every overdose, every body buried at Arlington. And when the curse is spoken of, when people whisper about the inexplicable pattern that haunts the Kennedys, they often skip over Rosemary. But maybe hers is the most important story, because she was the first. And the rest, in some strange, silent way, followed her. Ted Kennedy. He was never supposed to carry the crown. Edward Moore Kennedy, the youngest of 9, the baby brother, the tail end of a legacy already decades in motion, entered American public life as a substitute. After Joe Jr. died in the war, after Jack was shot in Dallas, after Bobby bled out in Los Angeles, it was Ted who was left to bear the name. Not because he asked for it, but because he was the only one left standing. And even he didn't stand for long. In June 1964, 5 years before he would become the senior senator from Massachusetts, and only months after his brother Bobby was elected to the Senate from New York, Ted Kennedy was aboard a small plane flying to a Democratic convention in Springfield. Somewhere over Southampton, Massachusetts, the plane lost control and slammed into an apple orchard. The pilot and one of Ted's aides were killed instantly. Ted was pulled from the wreckage by another passenger, Senator Birch Bay. He had a broken back, a punctured lung, internal bleeding, and several ribs shattered like matchsticks. He spent 5 months in the hospital. It was his first close encounter with the family's invisible gravity, the thing that pulled them, again and again, toward the brink. And it would not be the last. He recovered. He returned to work. He began his decades-long Senate career, eventually becoming one of the most influential legislators in American history. But Ted Kennedy's political genius was never able to outrun the damage left behind by a life lived in the Kennedy name. And in 1969, the legacy nearly collapsed on him. On the night of the 18th of July, during a reunion of Bobby Kennedy's former campaign staff on Chappaquiddick Island, Ted drove off a wooden bridge with a young woman in the passenger seat, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechne. The car flipped and landed in the pond below. Ted escaped. Mary Jo did not. He did not report the accident for more than 9 hours. By the time police arrived, the car had already been discovered by local fishermen. Kopechne's body was found in the back seat. The official cause of death was drowning, but details remain murky. The delay in reporting, the uncertainty about the timeline, the inconsistencies in Ted's statement, all became fuel for speculation, scandal, and political damage that would trail him for the rest of his life. He later said he dove repeatedly into the water, trying to save her, that he panicked, that he didn't remember how he got back to his hotel. In a televised statement, he asked the people of Massachusetts whether he should resign. He didn't. He pled guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and received a suspended sentence. But something else was suspended that day: his chances of ever becoming president. The Kennedy machine, so familiar with tragedy, pivoted into damage control. But this time, the story wouldn't die. It wasn't about enemies or politics or assassins. It was about personal failure, about recklessness, about survival and silence. And this time, it was complicated. Because Ted Kennedy lived. He went on to serve in the Senate for nearly 47 years. He authored, or co-authored, more than 2,500 pieces of legislation. He fought for civil rights, education, health care, and immigration reform. He became the Lion of the Senate, a title he wore not with pride, but with weary acceptance. But beneath the accomplishments, he carried ghosts. He buried more siblings than most people have friends. He watched his nephews die one by one. He endured scandal after scandal, including a late-life memoir that painted him as a man caught between responsibility and ruin. And still, he kept showing up, to hearings, to funerals, to family Christmas cards taken with faces airbrushed around absence. In 2008, during Barack Obama's campaign for the presidency, Kennedy, then fighting brain cancer, made one final, fiery speech at the Democratic National Convention. It was a moment that felt almost redemptive. The crowd stood, the cameras lingered. The voice, though weaker, still carried something resonant. He looked like a man who had finally made peace with the story he couldn't escape. He died on the 25th of August, 2009, at his home in Hyannis Port. The cancer had spread. The speeches had stopped. The legacy was complete. And in the end, he was buried next to his brothers, Jack, and Bobby, in Arlington National Cemetery, the last of the original brothers, the last son of Rose and Joseph. But even in death, the symmetry wouldn't quite hold. Because unlike his brothers, Ted had lived long enough to be judged by his full life, not just its ending. And what that life revealed was a contradiction. A man who authored historic legislation and caused historic grief. A man who embodied both the myth and the failure. Who stood at the helm of his family while it slowly disappeared beneath him. And in that way, Ted Kennedy may be the most complete expression of what the Kennedy name truly became. Not a crown, not a curse, but a contradiction so deep it could only end in ambiguity. And yet, even after Ted, the name would carry on. Not with grandeur, but with quiet, steady erosion. Because some legacies don't explode. They fade. They slip into addiction, into despair, into silence. And when the world stops watching, they continue on, out of sight, in guest rooms, in canoes, in shadows. And sometimes, late at night, they still go driving. Joseph P. Kennedy II. He was named after the original Golden Son, the first Joseph, the brother who died in a flaming bomber over East Suffolk during World War II. It was a name meant to signify continuity, restoration, a kind of resurrection by lineage. But for Joseph P. Kennedy II, son of Robert F. Kennedy, carrying that name was less about legacy and more about friction. Born in 1952, Joe II grew up in the aftermath of great ambition and greater loss. His uncles had been assassinated. His father's face was on stamps. He came of age surrounded by headstones and expectations. But unlike his father, Joe didn't rush toward the spotlight. He took a slower path, business, nonprofit work, and eventually, politics, on his own timeline. Not as heir to a throne, but as someone attempting to occupy the same room without triggering all the alarms. He did, eventually, follow the family script. He entered Congress in 1987, representing Massachusetts' 8th District, the same seat his uncle JFK had once held. He stayed in office until 1999, earning a reputation as a practical, progressive legislator with a strong focus on social justice. He ran Citizens Energy Corporation, a nonprofit that provided low-cost heating oil to the poor. He spoke with the practiced cadence of a Kennedy, but without the gravitas, without the myth. But long before his congressional career, something had already happened. Something that couldn't be undone with good policy or philanthropy. On the 13th of August, 1973, Joe II was 20 years old. He was driving a Jeep on a quiet dirt road in Nantucket with his younger brother David and family friend Pam Kelly. The ride wasn't reckless, but it wasn't cautious either. At one point, the Jeep swerved and flipped. David suffered minor injuries. Pam Kelly, 17 years old at the time, was thrown from the vehicle and suffered a spinal cord injury that left her permanently paralyzed. It was a summer day turned catastrophic. The kind of story that doesn't make headlines until someone with the Kennedy name is behind the wheel. Pam was airlifted. The family went into emergency response mode. Statements were drafted. Lawyers stepped in. The accident never resulted in formal charges, but the implications hovered. A young woman's life altered forever. Another Kennedy behind the wheel in a story that felt too familiar. Joe II visited Pam in the hospital. The family helped pay for her medical expenses. There were lawsuits, settlements, silences. She recovered what she could, but her life had changed. Her body had changed, and though she rarely spoke about it publicly, she later admitted that the aftermath felt like being frozen in someone else's story. Joe never faced criminal prosecution. The incident was treated as an accident, which by all legal standards, it was. But that word, accident, rarely lands cleanly in a Kennedy context. Because every accident seems to rhyme with the one before. For Joe, the crash was a fork in the road. He eventually found his way back to public service, but he did so with a cautious rhythm. He remained active in Democratic politics, but never ran for higher office. He was considered a potential candidate for Senate, for governor, but he declined. The shadow was too large, the name too loud, and maybe, deep down, he knew what chasing that next step might cost. In later years, Joe II became one of the more stable figures in the family. He remarried, raised children, stayed active in humanitarian work. He kept his profile modest by Kennedy standards. But the Jeep accident in Nantucket never fully vanished. It remains a quiet entry in the larger catalog. A story without a scandal, without an investigation, without a martyr. Just a young man, a quiet road, a sharp turn, and someone else's life forever changed. And yet, that's what makes it so hard to look away. Because the Kennedy legacy isn't built only on those who die. It's built on those who survive, who keep going, who walk away from the wreckage and try to keep moving forward. And sometimes, survival leaves a different kind of scar, one that doesn't photograph, one that doesn't end with a speech. Joe II tried to live a good life. He tried to turn the name into a tool, not a trap. But the pattern doesn't always need catastrophe. Sometimes, it's content to work in subtler ways, in wheelchairs, in lawsuits, in quiet guilt, in lives that are never quite the same. And just when it seems the tide has settled, when the next generation begins to breathe more easily, something comes back. A diagnosis. A new kind of break. Because even the youngest Kennedys weren't spared. Not by cancer. Not by randomness. Not even at 12 years old. Edward M. Kennedy Jr. There are tragedies you see coming, and ones that arrive too soon to recognize. For Edward Moore Kennedy Jr., the oldest son of Senator Ted Kennedy, the collision came not in a plane, a car, or a courtroom, but in the cells of his own body. He was born on the 26th of September, 1961, into a family already defined by both power and pain. His Uncle John was in the White House by the time he turned 1. His Uncle Bobby was on the campaign trail before Edward reached kindergarten. By the time he was 7, one had been assassinated. By 11, the second was gone too. He was a child during the decade the Kennedy family went from legacy to litany. But in 1973, when he was just 12, the spotlight turned inward. Not onto another public loss, but into the marrow of his bones. Edward was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, a rare and aggressive form of bone cancer. It was found in his right leg, near the knee. And unlike most Kennedy tragedies, this one wasn't instant. It was slow, procedural, clinical. It came with options, timelines, percentages. There was hope, but only through pain. Doctors gave the family 2 choices: a complicated experimental surgery that might preserve the limb, or a full amputation. Ted Kennedy, by then a seasoned senator, a veteran of scandal and survival, asked his son what he wanted. And Edward, 12 years old, scared but sharp, made his choice. He chose the amputation. The surgery was swift. The leg was removed above the knee. In its place, a prosthetic, a new way of walking, and a lifelong adjustment to something he didn't ask for. While other Kennedy children were learning to sail, to ski, to move through the world with the fluidity of privilege, Edward Jr. was learning to fall, to brace, to balance. And yet, he adapted. He attended Wesleyan University, earned a law degree from the University of Connecticut, and built a career as an advocate for disability rights. His speeches, always measured, often personal, carried a quiet power. He didn't exploit the family name, but he didn't hide from it either. He used it carefully, channeling his experience into policy, serving on numerous boards and commissions, fighting for those whose disabilities made them invisible. In 2015, he followed the inevitable gravitational pull of family and ran for office, serving a term in the Connecticut State Senate. His campaign was low-key, his style pragmatic. He didn't grandstand. He didn't echo his father's fiery cadence. He simply worked. But Edward's story stands out in the Kennedy lineage not because it ends in death, but because it doesn't. He survived. The cancer never came back. He married, had children, and continued his work in law and advocacy. He went skiing, hiking, and climbed mountains, literal and metaphorical, with a prosthetic leg and a kind of understated defiance. His story, at least so far, is one of endurance. But even that word, endurance, carries a shadow. Because surviving in the Kennedy family is its own quiet burden. To watch cousins die, uncles be assassinated, siblings struggle. To live past 12, past 22, past 50. To raise your children in a house where every wall contains a name they're expected to live up to, or outlive. Edward Kennedy Jr. did not become a senator like his father. He did not run for president like his uncle or grandfather. But his life remains emblematic of a different pattern in the Kennedy saga. The weight of continuing, the dignity of recovery, the grief of watching from the edge as the legacy rewrites itself in tragedy, again and again. And perhaps more than anyone, Edward Jr. understands what's waiting in the margins of survival. He saw it clearly in 1973, when his leg was taken to save his life. He saw it again and again. Each time the phone rang, each time the news broke, each time the cameras returned. Because survival doesn't guarantee escape. Sometimes it just delays the pattern. And sometimes, as another Kennedy would learn in the early hours of a humid spring morning in 2006, survival brings its own quiet breakdown. No bullets. No crashes. Just one man, a barricade, a prescription, and a truth too heavy to drive around. Patrick J. Kennedy. He was the youngest child of Ted Kennedy, and maybe the last one to still believe he could outrun the name. Patrick Joseph Kennedy II was born in 1967, just months before his uncle Robert was assassinated, and months after his cousin Arabella's unmarked grave finally received attention. His childhood was marked by funerals and cameras. The Kennedy compound at Hyannis Port was, by then, less a sanctuary than a mausoleum with a lawn. And Patrick, sensitive, cerebral, and prone to inner storms, grew up watching the mythology bend inward. Like many of his cousins, he went into politics. The path was there, paved in mourning and ambition. He was elected to the Rhode Island House of Representatives at 21 and, just 4 years later, to the U.S. House of Representatives. He served from 1995 to 2011, one of the youngest and longest-serving Kennedys in federal office. He spoke well. He voted progressively. He led on issues of mental health, parity, and substance abuse policy, causes that, over time, began to reveal their urgency in his own life. Because beneath the speeches and the committee appointments, Patrick Kennedy was unraveling. His struggle wasn't explosive. It was the kind that waits patiently, inside hotel minibars, bathroom cabinets, prescription bottles labeled in tidy black ink. By his own admission, he had begun using alcohol and prescription medication to self-medicate in his early 20s, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, sleep aids, painkillers, stimulants to wake him up, sedatives to slow him down. It wasn't a secret within the family. It just wasn't something they discussed publicly. Until the crash. In the early hours of May 4, 2006, Patrick Kennedy drove his Mustang convertible into a concrete barrier near Capitol Hill. It was 2:45 a.m. The car's lights were off. The airbags deployed. No one was hurt, but the damage wasn't to the car. It was to the story. Capitol Police reported that Kennedy appeared disoriented and impaired, but insisted no sobriety test was administered. The reason? They were told by supervisors that the congressman was to be driven home. Witnesses, however, began talking. They claimed Kennedy had been drinking at a nearby bar earlier that night. He claimed otherwise, said he was taking prescribed medication, including Ambien and Phenergan, which had caused disorientation. The press circled. Headlines screamed, and then Patrick did something no one expected. He told the truth. The next day, he held a press conference and admitted he had a problem. He announced he was entering rehab. It was his second stint in just over 2 years, but this time, he didn't retreat. He leaned in. He began speaking openly, almost compulsively, about mental illness, substance abuse, and the systemic failures of both public policy and private silence. And in doing so, Patrick Kennedy did something few of his relatives had managed. He reframed the Kennedy curse. Not as an external force, planes, guns, waves, but as something internal. A cycle of untreated trauma, inherited pressure, and public silence. He wrote a memoir. He gave talks. He launched the Kennedy Forum, an organization dedicated to mental health advocacy and policy reform. He made himself a case study. He let people see the tremors, the compulsions, the pills, the exhaustion, the failure. But even in this transparency, the echoes of the family lingered. Because Patrick didn't crash once. He crashed again in 2008, and again in 2009. Car accidents, investigations, more rehab, more headlines. And through it all, the same tension that haunted so many of his relatives, a need to serve versus a need to survive. In 2011, he didn't seek re-election. He left Congress to focus on recovery, on family, on advocacy. He married, had children, tried to build a quieter life. But he remained outspoken, a rare thing in a family where silence had often been a defense mechanism. He criticized how the family had hidden Rosemary Kennedy. He spoke about his father's alcoholism, his own relapses, the tendency of the Kennedys to treat pain as a private shame rather than a public issue. Patrick's version of the curse wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fatal, but it was ongoing, chronic, manageable but never cured. His was the version where tragedy doesn't kill, it just lingers. It waits in the bloodstream, in moments of weakness, in the click of a bottle cap. And in this, perhaps, lies the clearest expression of what the Kennedy legacy has become. Not a myth, not a morality tale, but a chronic condition. Something inherited, faced daily, never fully overcome. And even now, after so many funerals, so many wrecks, so many obituaries that read like pre-written scripts, the story continues. Because the name continues. Still attached to children, still whispered in headlines, still echoing in empty rooms, still waiting for the next quiet sound, a knock on the door, a splash in the water, a click on the runway.